few words, this is REST publications, in case you are just joining us. REST publication, we mean real estate services and transactions publications. In our episodes and various presentations, we normally discuss about real estate issues, real estate investments, and real estate services, and issues to note about real estate transactions for betterment of your real estate investments. You are welcome on board. REST Publication is a subsidiary of REIS Academy. REIS Academy is a center for real estate professional development in Lagos, Nigeria. I have the privilege of being the Director of Studies and the Chief Executive Officer of the Academy. And I am the lead advisor of Olaleka Modern Consulting. My name is Surveyor and Valuer Olaleka Abodeni. Welcome back. Today, our topic is actually on another aspect of viability studies. Very interesting aspect of viability studies. We have been discussing, viability studies for about 2 or 3 episodes now, emphasizing on key issues that investors need to pay attention to, and the analysts, the professionals too, need to take into consideration to ensure a reliable and highly marketable viability analysis. In the last episode, we have discussed about cash flow projection, how to handle projection of cash outflow and how to handle projection of cash inflow. An important aspect of that discussion is actually about the use of project schedule, or what we call program schedule, to be able to do our cash flow projection, so that our projection will not just be based on intuitions or mental analysis. Today, another important aspect that we'll be discussing on is on rates, applicable rates, choice of rates for processings in our viability analysis. Viability analysis involves series of processes depending on the techniques. Our focus so far have been contemporary techniques of assessing viability of a project that are cash flow based. Example of such techniques is what we call net present value. This is well known to most investors and even professionals. Another good example of such is net terminal value, right? Then we have what we call internal rate of return. We have cash flow based residual analysis, and so on and so forth, among the common contemporary cash flow based appraisal techniques. Now, in adopting all these appraisal techniques, one thing that is required, that is common to particularly whether NTA, NTV, or MPV, or internal rate of return, is what we call rates. Rates. These rates can take the form of a discounting rate, and it can take the form of a compounding rate. It depends on the methods that we have to use. What we know commonly is that we have discounting rates in appraisal, but we have appraisal techniques that involves compounding. Hence, there will be a case of compounding rates. So the choice of rates is very, very important, and that's what we'll be discussing in today's episode. But before we go into the choice of rates and how to guide ourselves in terms of making appropriate choice of rates, so as to ensure that we have a proper viability analysis, let us first of all look at what we mean by discounting and what exactly do we mean by compounding. The understanding of this is very, very important. You see, when you talk about appraisal, we are talking about having to work with projections of outflow and projections of inflows. As at a point when we are doing the analysis, it's an ex-ante analysis. And as an ex-ante analysis, we have projections and expectations. That means, of course, we equally have inflow, or let me say cash flow, at various timing, either cash inflow excuse me, or cash outflow at various timing over the development period. Take development period of 3 years, for example. The cash outflow could be, you have different outflow at different time within the development period. Just as you have inflow at different amounts at different time within the development period. It then means that those figures, they are not like terms. Even, let's say, for purpose of simplicity, we have expectation of, let's say, 100 million at every 6 months, for example. They are not the same. 100 million today and 100 million in another 6 months are not the same. They are not like terms. They are not to be added as 100 million plus 100 million in appraisal terms. Because of what? The implication of time value of money. So if we take today as our reference point, that we want to make all our inflow relative to the present day, then we'll be talking about discounting. Because of time value of money. We'll be talking about discounting, bringing all our inflows as relative to their time to a common present time. That is discounting. Bringing them to a common present, and what do? We try to net off whatever would have been an accumulated interest that have made the figure what the figure is as at the time of the inflow. Let me give you an example there. Let's say you are entitled to 100 million naira now and another 100 million naira in 6 months, and the rate on pro rata basis is at, for purpose of argument, 1%. The 100 million naira that is to come in now, or that you have to expend now, has more value than the one you have to expend in the next 6 months. Because if that 100 million naira were to be allowed to be in an investment vehicle to accumulate interest, it would have grown at 1% every month, more than what will be 100 million naira in 6 months. That then means that 100 million naira in 6 months' time represents a figure that is lesser than 100 million, to which interest on 1% basis, as in case of this example, have been added and have grown to become 100 million naira in 6 months' time. That's the effect of time value of money. That therefore means that the 100 million naira figure today and the 100 million naira figure in 6 months' time, they are not the same. So given that, we need to confine them to like terms, bring them to a common time horizon, which is present time, in case we are using present time as reference. And to do that, we will now do what we call discounting. All future inflows or outflows will be discounted to their present value. So the rates to be used to discount them, choice of that rate is very, very important. You can have a case of compounding, where the reference points is the end of the investment period. In the first example I've given, the reference point will be now, which is the beginning of the investment period, or the beginning of the development period. But when you are talking about terminal value, where you will need compounding, the reference point, time horizon, is the end of the investment period. In that situation, discounting will not be applicable. You are projecting and compounding all inflows and outflow to the end of the investment period. And that is the case when you are applying net terminal value. So, given that, now compounding, therefore, what does that mean? It will mean that we have to now gross up the capital or all the various outflow or inflow for the interest or return they supposed to, or they could be deemed to accumulate. So that is compounding. You are adding up those interests on monthly basis or yearly basis, as the case may be. We'll come back to that. Whether it's to be monthly, whether it's to be quarterly, whether it's to be yearly. We'll come back to that. So you compound. That is, you recognize the earning potential of the capital that you are outlaying now over the investment period based on the compounding period, and see what it will become at the end of the investment period or the development period, as the case may be. That is compounding. So with this in mind, it then means that our choice of rates, that rate could be either to do discounting or to do compounding, depending on the choice of our method of appraisal. If we are using MPV, then we'll be talking about discounting. NPV, that's net present value analysis. We'll be talking about discounting rate. If we are using internal rate of return, we'll be talking about applicable rates, our trial rates being discounting rates too. Then, if we are using NTV, we'll be talking about our rate being a compound rate, even though it's the same figure, it's the same rate. But the process that we subject that rate to makes the process the rate to either be discounting or compound. So, with this in mind, we can now look at, okay, how do we make choice of rates? Before I go into making the choice of rates, it is important for us to understand the likely finance structure of our project development. Our projects can be funded, can be financed based on different structures, different models. In some cases, it can be integrated model. In some cases, it can be just simple model, depending on the source of the finance. What is the source of finance to be used to fund the projects? In the next, when I come back after this short break, I will be going into these full details for us to understand the finance structure, so as to be able to now know how this will determine our choice of interest rate. Thank you. It's my pleasure to have you back. Our discussion continues on making choice, the choice of rate, therefore compounding or discounting in liability analysis. And before we went on break, we have discussed about what we meant by discounting and what is meant by compounding, and how that is involved in liability analysis. Because as a matter of fact, it's wrong to sum unlike terms together. So to be able to make our inflow to be like terms, we need to convert them to figures of the same time horizon, either as a present now or in the future. As a present now means present value, and that will require discounting. In the future, maybe we are looking at the end of the investment period, then plus a terminal value that will require compounding. Now, and I emphasize that for our choice of rate, it's not enough. Yes, you need rates to either do discounting or do compounding. But that rates, permit me to call it rate of interest, or rate of discounting rate or compounding rates, right? Depends on the finance structure for the development. It is not cast in stone, and that it could always take one specific rate at any point in time. No. So in making choice, analysts have to be guided with the kind of financing structure for the project. And I said earlier that financing structure depends on the source of the fund. We can have a case where you have simple finance structure. You can have a case where you have integrated finance structure. For example, depending on the source of funding, you can have what we call debt capital. That is very clear. It becomes a debt capital on the project where it is raised from money market in terms of maybe from bank, getting facility, getting loan from bank to fund a project. Whereas that the bank or the finance institution is equally an investor, but it's coming in here as a debt capital provider, and its interest is on what will be the return on his own investment too. The return on investment to a debt capital provider is interest rates. So how much will be the expectation of such interest rate? So the one source of funding project is debt capital, which is from either banks or finance institutions and what have you. It can even be from insurance company, where such organization provides the capital only because of anticipated return in form of interest as a return on capital. Interest, which in this case will be like what we call cost of fund. So that is debt capital. Where the project is financed with debt capital, the choice of interest rate will be different, and we'll look at that. The second source of fund could be equity capital. In this case, equity capital means fund from the investor, fund from the developer. Now, dear viewers, let's get it right. Equity capital can have different models, right? It can be the direct fund from the investor. It can be a consociate fund pooled from other subsidiaries or other forms of investment owned by the investor into the project. And it can equally be from venture capitalists, people that choose to buy into the equity participation of the project. Venture capitalists, like what you call other people's money, can be that. Even in form of crowdfunding, can take the form of equity capital. In this case, the investor is looking at providing the fund to have a share of return on investment, to have a share of profits. So the assessment of return to such an investor is based on the profits, not based on a percentage of the capital that's just a predetermined percentage of the capital that's provided. The sharing of the return from share of the profit could be based on the proportion of capital contributed. But what will be shared will be the profits that have been realized or generated from the investment or from the development. So that is equity capital. Whether it's the developer that provides the fund directly, or whether the fund is coming from his friends and family, or whether the fund is coming from co-investors, passive investors, who is just investing capital in the developments. And as a good example that I mentioned, that of venture capitalists, people that provide capital into the investment for actualization of the investment, just to have share of the return from the investments. We can take that form. Equity capital too can take the form of joint venture participation. Whether the development partner is coming in as joint venture partners, or the land provider is coming in as joint venture partners, their contribution there will akin to equity capital. The objective is primarily to benefit from the profits. So it is different from debt capital. Now, apart from this, we can equally now have, and which is very, very common, the common scenario is where you have a structure that combines both equity and debt capital. Both equity and debt capital. Before I go to that, I remember let me mention that under equity capital too, you can have where you have forward sales, can introduce the project into a form of equity capital. Subscribers funds can introduce the project to a form of equity capital. And the way the treatment of their return is different. Because in this case, of course, when you're having forward sales, as I said earlier in one of our episodes, there might likely be associated costs in terms of having to allow some discounts. Right? That's the benefit to the subscribers that is bringing the fund higher enough. So we can have case of combined structure where we have combination of equity capital and debt capital. In that circumstance, it's common that even if a project will be funded with equity capital, like for example in Nigeria and most African countries, I don't know of an advanced one, but I'm sure even given what it is documented, it's equally operational, right? You have a situation where you want to actually finance a project with equity capital, and for whatever reason, you will be required to make a contribution, maybe 30%, 20%, or 40% contribution. So you want to finance with debt capital. So you make 30 or 40 or 20% contribution, equity contribution. That means even while the remainder is funded with debt capital, the investor or the developer already has equity participation in it, which is the contribution, which is like 20, 30, or 40% as the case may be. So in that wise, such a project is rather funded with a finance structure that combines both equity and debt capital. So, and in some cases, it might require that equity capital will come in as a bridging finance. So where you have that combination, that is another finance structure where you are combining two sources or categories of capital to fund the investment. Now, again, under debt capital, another forms of structure that we could have could be where you have stage funding. Is debt capital at the beginning, your seed fund is from maybe a short-term loan. You get a short-term loan for a seed fund to make the project bankable, to make the project sellable, to make the project be attractive to funding, right? So then you now look for a long-term funding. That long-term funding is equally a debt capital, but we absorb the short-term funding, and of course, continue funding the project until the project can now pay back. That is another structure in terms of funding, and it's very common. Like debt capital again, let's look at this aspect of, in Nigeria now it's common, this aspect of what we call sukuk, right? When you are combining finance structure, before an asset or a project will be bankable, you need seed fund. That seed fund, you might have to do, if the equity capital is available to do that, you use equity capital to do your seed funding, then debt capital will come and continues. Where your debt capital comes and pay off your equity capital and continues, it will then mean that you are actually funding based on debt capital completely. You only use equity capital as a bridging finance there. That will equally have to be reflected in the appraisal process, in the analysis. But the moment the debt capital captures and absorbs that bridging finance, then it means that bridging finance is just to bridge a gap. It's not actually like as if one is combined. It's different from when you actually have combination of equity and debt capital as finance structure. Combination of equity and debt capital as finance structure will mean that you have committed a percentage of equity capital to it, and you have committed a percentage of debt capital to it for the investment period or for the development period. But where it's a bridging finance, it means like a seed fund that I mentioned, if you only bring in their money, maybe a kind of equity fund to make the project bankable and attractive to banks for debt funding, long-term debt funding, and in which case, when the capital comes in, debt capital comes in, the equity capital is recouped. In that way, that's different. That's not a case where equity and debt capital have been combined. Because equity only serves as seed fund there to make the project bankable, and is recouped immediately the debt capital is realized. So it will not more be in that investment vehicle till the end of the investment or development period. Again, you can have case where you have the debt capital as a bridging finance or a take-off fund, like a seed fund, right? Take-off, short-term loan, maybe 1 year or 2 years loan, 2 years term loan, right? In such a way that, particularly all these loans that we can get from commercial banks in Nigeria and so on, in such a way that when you use that money, you use it as seed fund to make sure that the asset becomes bankable and attractive to either venture capitalists or to a case of long-term debt funding. Or a case of sukuk, you cannot go and, introduce it in the market, and raise capital from it. So the moment the capital comes in, either in form of equity or debt, the long-term funding comes in. It absorbs the bridging finance, the take-off fund, and continues in the investment till the end of the investment period or the development period. That is not a case where you have combined equity and debt capital, because you only use that to bridge a gap, to take off, and you recoup the money back at the end of that taking off. It does not rest or last in the investment for the investment or the development period. So, but the combination is you have a percentage of equity, you have a percentage of debt capital combined together, and they are there in the investment or development for the investment or development period. then in that circumstance, we will say you have combined both the two sources. Meanwhile, whether the scenario of having combined the two sources or the scenario of using one source as a takeoff or a seed capital, a seed fund, or a bridging fund, whether taking off or midway where there is liquidity or positive fund or what have you, all these finance reality, as we will see in our future episode, have to be reflected in your appraisal process. But the essence of our discussion here is to understand that project can be financed with different sources. Meaning that you can have different finance structure for your property or project development. So depending on the finance structure, then the choice that finance structure will determine what will be the choice or basis of selecting our distancing or compounding rates. That is the essence of this background. And by the special grace of God sparing our life, and with you being part of this show, we will continue our discussion on how to make the choice now. We have understood that we have debt capital, we have equity capital, you can have cases where you combine, where you have such. How do you make choice of your discounting of compounding rates? What will be the basis? See you during the next episode. I remain Olade Kabode.